everyone. My name is Alaina G. Levine. I am president of Quantum Success Solutions. I'm a professional speaker, a STEM career coach, and author of 2 books, Networking for Nerds and Create Your Unicorn Career, which will be out this year. I'm also a science writer, so I am really psyched for our panel today. We have an awesome set of stars in science editing and publishing who are going to talk to you today about their career, this profession, how you can build a career in this space that brings you joy, meaning, and money. You get paid appropriately, and we're going to be able to help you advance the goals that you have for your career. Before we begin, I just want to let you know we're going to be monitoring the chat and the Q&A, so we want you to be giving us your questions, throw them in the chat, but we want to hear from you first and foremost. Can you throw in the chat, where are you in your career? Are you a grad student, an undergrad, a postdoc? Are you a faculty member? Are you mid-career? Are you a senior leader? Are you a Nobel laureate? Throw in the chat so that we can see where you are in your career and when you are in your career, so we can help to advance your goals. I'm seeing postdocs. I'm seeing several postdocs. Look at this. We got a grad student. We got a senior undergrad, a couple of undergrads. This is excellent. Thank you so much for being here. Oh, just so lots and lots of different early career folks. We're thrilled you're here. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started because this is going to be really fun, really insightful. I am thrilled to introduce our panel. I want to start with introducing Monica Young. She is the news editor of Sky and Telescope magazine. Hi, Monica. Welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm so glad you're here. And I want to just ask you, what is your quick one tip for building a joyous career in science editing?
I have a lot of tips, but I think the main one is to be curious and also to stay curious, because it can be hard to keep that curiosity going once you get into a career, but just staying curious throughout, and it kind of helps you with whatever you're doing, whether you're interviewing a scientist or networking or finding story ideas. So
I love that tip. And, it's such a great way to start the conversation because, after all, astronomers, astrophysicists, cosmologists, cosmetologists, and planetary scientists, you are all really curious by nature. You got into the business of astronomy and the research of astronomy because you're curious. And so, Monica, you're saying that this innate curiosity about the nature of the universe actually can help us to be successful in careers in editing?
absolutely. And curiosity in people too. I think it helps a lot in terms of when you're networking, getting to know other people and seeing where they're at. When you're interviewing a scientist, kind of understanding their thought process with how they approach a problem. So curiosity can kind of come into play in a lot of different ways.
I love it. Thank you so much, Monica. I'd next like to introduce Paul Woods. He is the chief editor of Nature Astronomy. Hey, Paul, how are you doing today?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you. Glad to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. And of course, you and I, we've collaborated before. Paul, can you give us your number one quick tip for building a really fun and successful career in science editing?
Yeah, my one tip would be to read widely. So, read outside of your own specialized subject. Try to figure out what's happening in astronomy. What are the hot topics? What are people working on? Where is the funding going? Keep yourself up to date with kind of the cutting edge of research in astronomy, and that will put you in a good place to apply for specifically science editing jobs. Yeah.
Well, and Paul, what's super awesome about that tip, and I love that you brought it up at the top of the hour, is that if I'm going to transition from astronomy into scientific editing, scientific publishing, basically what you're saying is that I can still contribute and be connected to the astronomical research community. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the highlights of the job is that you get to talk to or email, work with amazing astronomers and astrophysicists every day. You get to go to conferences, hear talks, hear presentations, read press releases. It's a really good way to, still keep in contact with the academic side of astronomy, but, have the security of a permanent job.
I love it. Security and astronomy. So you get the best of both worlds here.
Yep.
I love it. Thanks, Paul. And last but not least, I want to introduce Mark Zastrow. Mark is the senior editor of Astronomy magazine. And we met at the AAS meeting, I believe it was just a few months ago, right? At the winter meeting?
That's right.
Right. And Mark, we were on a roundtable on science writing, science communication. So I'm really excited to hear from you today, Mark. And Mark, what is your number one quick tip for building this exciting career in this space?
Ooh, I loved Monica's and Paul's. I'm going to build off of them and say my one tip is take every opportunity that you can to meet people, whether they're people in your field, people outside of your field, people in editing or writing or journalists. Whenever you're in a, for example, maybe a conference setting, there are probably journalists there or editors there. Take every opportunity that you can to meet them. And another way that you can really meet people is by joining the National Association of Science Writers. NASW is a fantastic organization. And also any other organizations that you may want to apply to, the professional organizations, affinity groups. I'm also a member of the Asian American Journalists Association. And the networks that these organizations are able to enable have been a huge help to me in my career.
Likewise, I am a huge proponent and advocate for the National Association of Science Writers. Diane, if we haven't already, could you just throw that link? Oh, you already did. Thank you so much. It is a fantastic organization. Mark, I love your concept of really just keeping apprised of networks and connecting with people. You never know what opportunity you're going to get, so you want to look for as many opportunities as you possibly can. Speaking of opportunities, I'm going to take this opportunity to start the panel with you, Mark. Let's start with you. You know, we hear a lot about different types of careers that astronomers can pursue and how valuable they are in many, many, many different aspects and corners of the multiverse. And we've heard from our members at the AAS that they want to learn about science publishing, science editing, but I think there might be some confusion about what that actually means and entails. So I wondered if you could sort of give us a lay of the land, tell us a little bit about what science editing, science publishing looks like from your perspective in Astronomy Magazine, and also tell us a little bit about what you actually do, please.
Sure. Well, from my perspective, I guess, start with my day job. What I do mostly is I edit stories for the magazine. And so I'm reaching out to our authors, to our contributors, talking to folks on staff, sometimes writing myself, but mostly commissioning stories from freelance authors, freelance writers, taking their manuscripts, working with them to make them as good as they possibly can be. And then I also then work with the art team at Astronomy Magazine to help work with them to lay out these stories. So in the end, what you get is a product that you can hold in your hands. It's a kind of a rare opportunity, I think, that I do get to still work with a true print magazine. And we have fantastic people who have been working, in our art department and on the print side of things for a long time. But the wider that's just, one tiny part of the landscape of science editing. And before I was at Astronomy Magazine, I was a freelance writer and editor. And I was based in Seoul, Korea for about 5 years, from 2015 to 2020. And so as a freelancer, then I was, pitching stories as a writer and as a reporter to editors at outlets like Nature and New Scientist and sometimes Sky and Telescope, and working as a reporter to report out those stories. I was also freelancing as a science editor, as an editor for EOS, the AGU publication, and also taking commissions from other publications, so many different kinds of publications that were interested in hearing stories from Korea, where I was based, science stories. And so that included, professional trade publications, like in the vein of EOS, but sometimes even more industry related as well. And also institutional magazines from research institutes or from universities who wanted to cover a story in their publication as well. So it really, it was a really fun time of my career to sort of interface with all these different aspects of the science editing and writing world.
I love it. How would you define, like you described a little bit about what you do, how would you define the profession of science editing or science publishing? How would you describe it?
I would say it's the fundamental job, right, is of editing, if you will, is taking a document and making it sing, making it be as clear as it possibly can be. And we get a lot of joy out of taking a manuscript and working with an author to try to communicate the ideas that they have as clearly as we possibly can. I mean, that's the kind of very narrow aspect of the job, and the rest of it is, as Paul said, being apprised of what's happening, knowing what stories are stories and are going to be interesting to serve your audience. That's always what it comes down to, is you're not working for the profession, you're not working for the scientists, you're working for your readers. And you're trying to deliver them the best possible and the clearest and most, fun to read product that you possibly can.
Such an important distinction to remind ourselves of. Who is that key stakeholder? It's the reader. We're trying to give them information that they can take action on, whatever that happens to be. Thanks so much for that, Mark. Monica, I'd love to hear from you. How do you define science editing, science publishing, and what do you do at Sky and Tell?
Yeah, I'll do the second part first. So at Sky and Telescope, I'm the news editor. So I primarily, I write, I commission, and I edit news stories. That means I read a lot of press releases, determining what stories are worth covering. I commission them, meaning that we have kind of a stable of freelancers that we reach out to, or I sometimes get things pitched to me that I then evaluate. I edit those pieces, or I write them myself. Some stories I'm just interested in, and I still love writing, and so I try to write regularly too. And then those go on the website. What then happens is, after things go on the website for about a month, we compile a month's worth of stories into 4 pages called news notes in the print magazine. And so all of those, 1,000-word stories get shortened down to maybe 250 words. So that's kind of a challenge in itself, to try to encapsulate everything that was going on in that story, but in a much briefer format. I also, though, I help edit feature articles for the magazine. So those are the longer features that are typically anywhere from 2,400 to 3,200 words or so. And I was originally hired as the web editor for Sky and Telescope. And so I used to do more like kind of technical initiatives. We relaunched the interactive sky chart on our website, for example. I do less of that now. We actually have a web developer who works for us and does more of the technical things. That's how I got started. So, so a big part of that distinction. So you're talking about what is science editing and publishing. And as Mark was saying, the audience is so important. And we actually have a somewhat different audience for the online stories as we do for the magazine. And so the magazine tends to be the core group of the magazine readers are amateur astronomers. They are very knowledgeable about equipment, about observing. Sometimes they're usually, I would say they're fairly knowledgeable about astronomy terms as well. Things like redshift or pulsar, you can kind of throw into there without having to explain them at length. But at the same time, they're not trained astronomers. And so there are concepts that you have to make sure you're explaining things clearly to them so that they can really get what they want out of it, and to be able to know the science behind what they're seeing in the night sky. The online readers, on the other hand, I find that we're reaching a much more general audience. We can't necessarily expect them to even know what a pulsar is. So we typically throw in a brief definition of a pulsar, for example, just using that as an example. But and so kind of trying to distill that science in different formats for different audiences and different formats in terms of the short and long. And so it's a great challenge. It's a lot of fun to try to make that happen. Hopefully I've offered the right definition for you there. But,
yeah. No, that's very helpful. And I want to just go back to you really quickly, Mark. Your audience is whom? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, our audience is certainly a lot of overlap with Sky and Telescope. A lot of people tell us, we're subscribers to Astronomy and Sky and Tel. So it's a lot of amateur astronomers as well. Historically, astronomy has trended a bit more towards the mainstream in its print product. That is now, I think the audiences have converged a little bit, but it's still, we are not quite as, we do not assume as much knowledge in our print magazine, I think, as Sky and Tel would. I think would be a fair way to put it. But certainly, as Monica said, our audience online too, it's the wide world of space enthusiasts, which extends beyond the hobby, beyond the science, but beyond academia. It's just everyone who loves space.
Yes. That's very helpful. Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Monica. So basically, we have 2 magazines so far, Astronomy and Sky and Tel, that are not places where professional astronomers are publishing papers. This is articles that are being written by professional journalists and you and your team on different aspects of astronomy, innovation, and discovery. Now let's shift to Paul. Paul, you work for Nature Astronomy. It's a little bit of a different animal. I'd love for you to tell us what you do and how do you see the field and the profession of science editing and science publishing from your perspective, please.
Sure. So Nature Astronomy is a science journal, and I guess people here will be familiar with the AAS journals like the Astrophysical Journal and the Astrophysical Journal Letters and Planetary Science Journal. So those journals will have a team of editors who are academics. So they'll have a full-time professor position or quite a senior position at a university, and they will give some of their time, maybe 10 or 20% of the time, to edit for the journal. So that is, select papers and publish papers for the AAS journals. My job is kind of that, but more, because that's my full-time job. So there are very few full-time science journal editor jobs in the entire world in astronomy. So Nature has probably 5 or 6 of those, and then I guess Science and maybe some of the APS journals like PRL have full-time editors working on the journal. So my job primarily is handling the submissions that we get, the scientific papers that we get from astronomers and planetary scientists, and selecting those which we think would be best to publish, and then taking those through the peer review process. So that is finding appropriate reviewers for those papers, and then managing the peer review process. So asking for reports, looking at those reports, getting the authors to respond to the referees, and kind of iterating until we get to a conclusion whether we're going to accept that paper or reject that paper. So that's probably about 50-60% of my role. But then I also have a role like Mark and Monica. We have a kind of magazine section of the journal where we commission content. So we ask astronomers and planetary scientists to write about interesting topics, and they can be scientific topics, they can be community-oriented topics, opinion pieces and things that they want to promote, want to get out there. We have editorials every month, and we as editors write short kind of research highlights where we highlight excellent research in other journals. So we have that kind of magazine section, which has a more informal perhaps focus, but it's a good way that we as a journal can engage with the astronomy community, like the professional astronomy community. And so before you mentioned about readership, we're very much focused on the professional astronomer, professional planetary scientist, and we publish their research, but we also publish their opinions and their thoughts, and we write about topics that might interest them as professional astronomers.
Go ahead, please.
And so in terms of editing, what that means is, again, clarifying the message, basically. A lot of astronomers, a lot of academics in general, they don't have any training in how to write or how to present their work necessarily. Some of them are really excellent at making fantastic graphics and plots, but when it comes to the writing, sometimes it's not the best. And everybody needs a little bit of help to clarify the message, to have an external party look at their work and give them constructive criticism and help them to improve the clarity of what they're trying to communicate. So that's kind of part of my role as well, both in terms of the research articles that come in that we try to improve, try to clarify, and also in terms of like the magazine articles that we commission. We're trying to again get the message across as impactfully and as clearly as we can.
That's super helpful, Paul. And full disclosure to the audience, I had the privilege of writing a piece for the inaugural issue of Nature Astronomy
absolutely.
years ago. It's called The Multiverse is Your Playground. Diane, if you can find that article and throw it in the chat, please, for everybody. And that was a wonderful experience, by the way, to be able to collaborate with you and your team. So you have this really exciting job, exciting career. You're at the nexus of astronomy research and communications. You get the collaboration aspect of it. You're learning about all the different discoveries, even before they're published in many ways and in many times. Tell us a little bit about, Paul, your origin story, your career origin story. Tell us a little bit about your education, how you got to where you are today. How did you get your job? Can you give us a little bit of an overview of the life of Paul, please?
Sure. I mean, it was a very humble and probably very ordinary origin. So as an undergraduate, I found myself interested in physics and mathematics. And I had the chance to work with a really kind of inspiring professor who taught me some astronomy class, and that kind of was my first experience of astronomy and interaction with astronomy. I wasn't one of those kind of people that was constantly staring at the sky, and I didn't have a telescope at all. I was not inspired as a child into astronomy, but it was actually at university that I started getting interested in it from a kind of scientific point of view. And so that professor inspired me to start a PhD in astronomy, and there wasn't actually a PhD position available, and so I kind of bugged him until he could kind of sort out a position for me, and that was the start of my PhD. And after that, I did a PhD, and then kind of unusually, I did 4 postdocs. So that's probably 1, maybe 2 too many. But I really enjoyed doing the research side of things. And so, I wanted to continue being a full-time researcher as long as possible. And so instead of kind of progressing into the tenure track and into teaching, I tried to stay as close to research as possible. So I did a postdoc in the US. I worked for NASA for a few years, and then I came back to the UK where I started, and I did a few postdocs around the UK. Just doing research as an astronomer. My background is in astrochemistry, so I was interested in exotic molecules in space. But then eventually I got tired of moving between postdocs, moving around between cities and even different countries. And I kind of got to a place where I was losing my motivation to do research. And so I started looking around for other opportunities. And I guess, like many astronomers, I started looking at data science and, those kind of techie jobs. And just by chance, as I was looking, an advert for an editor at Nature Astronomy popped up. And that was just as the journal was launching. So that was 8 years ago. And they were at that time hiring the launch team. So they were looking for 3 editors and a chief editor. I just by luck saw the job ad, and I applied, and that worked out.
And now, how long have you been with this role, Paul?
Yeah, so I've been at Nature Astronomy 8 years, just over 8 years, and I've been chief editor just earlier this year, actually.
Oh, hey, mazel.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Yeah,
Well, this is such a great origin story. Thanks so much, Paul. Monica, we'd love to hear the story of Monica. Give us your origin story, a little bit about your education, your background, and how did you get your job at Sky and Tel?
Well, it depends on how far back you want to go, because I did get glasses in 2nd grade, and I asked my mom, hey, have those always been up there? Because I had never seen stars before. So that was kind of the origin, I guess. No, but I was always interested in astronomy growing up, not necessarily with a telescope, because I didn't have a telescope, and I don't think my parents would have let me go out after dark. But I was very interested in just learning about the science, and so I'd read like just a lot of popular books and that kind of thing. I went to college. I went to University of Pittsburgh. I studied physics and astronomy. I kind of moved around a lot, actually, with my majors. I was pre-med for 1 semester, and then I was like, no, never mind. And then I ended up adding English writing with the journalism track. That was a double major. And so I was kind of, I was really enjoying doing both things at university, and I felt like it really challenged both sides of my brain, if you will. I know that that's a myth, but it kind of works in this context. But then when it came time, I actually wanted to go into science writing. Both my parents were really wanted me to pursue research, and they basically convinced me that it would be an interesting thing to do, even if I don't end up doing that for a living. And so I applied to PhD programs, and I got my PhD at Boston University, working with Al Marshall there and with Martin Elvis at the Center for Astrophysics, and studying quasars, which interestingly I had actually done a research paper on in high school. And so I kind of felt like coming full circle in grad school, researching quasars again. This time, just X-ray astronomy was my main focus. And I think about like the fourth year of my PhD, I started getting kind of like, oh, I really miss writing. Like my undergrad was like really heavy in writing, and I did that a lot, like, maybe half my time was spent writing, and I was really missing that. And so I started just doing really random things. I wrote a review on a science book. I was a writer for, and then later an editor for the Association for Women in Science, which is, like Mark said, the affinity groups are a great way to find new opportunities. I actually even read something on the radio, and then I discovered I'm not cut out for radio. I talk way too quickly for that. And so anyway, so I was kind of going through this, and then I was applying for postdocs, and I wasn't sure what to do, because I was like, I don't know if I really want to do research, but I don't want to exit the field just yet. I don't know if I want to dive into science writing. And so what I ended up doing was a postdoc at Penn State. I worked with Neil Brandt studying quasars again, doing X-ray astronomy again, but also working with Barbara Kennedy, who was at the head of the media relations. And she graciously allowed me to write stories about, not press releases, they still handled those, but just doing some small stories on the astronomy department and what they were up to. And so I did that for about a year, and then I left. I had my son. I basically gave myself a little built-in maternity leave. But then I was like, okay, I want to do science writing. I started doing just some informational interviews with people in the area. I did one with somebody at the Boston Globe, and she, gave me some names. I ended up interviewing Kelly Beatty, who at the time was a freelancer for Sky and Telescope. He had been on staff at Sky and Tel. And he told me about an internship opportunity, which was not on their website. So that was kind of like the behind the scenes offering. The reason it wasn't on their website was because they needed the web editor, it turned out. So I did this internship for 2 weeks, and then they hired, I applied for the job, and then I was hired. So I basically had my 2-week internship, and then I had a full-time job. So that was a great, very lucky entry into the field. And it's difficult to tell people, hey, this is what you should do, because you can't line things up that way. But I do think it's really interesting that, like, of all of my colleagues, we all have a different way that we ended up here at Sky and Telescope. And so there's all these different, which is, exactly what you do, Alaina. It's like the crafting your unicorn career and all of that. So everybody here has done that to some extent. So.
And Monica, you've been now here in this role for how long?
For 12 years, because my oldest son was, not yet one when I started. And so he's like my barometer for how long I've been working.
I love it. Monica, I just have to take a sidestep because you used the key password, informational interviews, and you got this hidden job, this hidden internship, which led to a job and led to a career, led to security, led to enjoyment at Sky and Telescope. Such a game changer when you're networking to be so open-minded about that. And just quick show of hands at the panel, how many of you have benefited from this type of like open-minded networking? I know I have. Yeah, so it's really quite something to think about. You never know what information you're going to get. That's why, Mark, you were saying, like, take advantage of every opportunity, but really leaning into the networking, asking for those what are called informational interviews, as you said, Monica, so you can start to get to know people, but also so that people get to know you, right? You got invited to this internship because the person you were talking to saw how talented and brilliant and excited you were. And they're like, wait, Monica, we have this thing. We haven't even advertised it yet. Are you interested? And now suddenly you're solving a problem for them because they have this opening that they need to fill, and you've now made yourself available. So I love it. Congratulations to you, Monica, on all your success. Mark, we want to hear the story of Mark. Tell us about your career origin story, your career arc. and more about the work that you do, please.
Sure. I won't go as far back as Monica, but I did enjoy. I loved astronomy as a kid, and that was what I eventually wound up majoring in. And I quickly realized pretty quickly that I really enjoy doing research, but it might not be the career for me. Even in undergrad, I kind of felt this. What I seemed to be better at and more suited to was talking to people, doing outreach, teaching. I loved TAing, and I also loved writing. I loved writing as a kid. I wrote for my high school newspaper. But it wasn't really until the year after I graduated from undergrad that I started to realize that science writing was actually a thing that people do, that it was actually a career. And that actually came out of reading a lot of coverage about climate change. This was around 2010. And at the time, it felt like the media was treating it mainly as a political issue with two sides to the story and not a scientific issue. And so it was reading a lot of news stories when I started to realize that there were journalists who did specialize in science, who were communicating that science with technical clarity and also with moral clarity. And I thought, ooh, that's what I want to do. So I applied to graduate schools in astronomy, and I was hoping to get into one where I could be a PhD student and funded, but then also take journalism classes on the side. And so I wound up going to Boston University as well, which at the time was one of the very few master's programs. They had one of the very few master's programs specifically in science journalism within the journalism school. And so my goal was to go as far as I could in my PhD program. I wasn't sure how far I would make it, but learn as much as I could about the field by being involved in research. But then I always had it in the back of my mind that at some point I would transition. And so, as a grad student, I was always trying to sort of engineer opportunities to meet people who were in writing. One of the things that we did in the department was the students would get to invite a speaker to come. We could for a colloquium, and we could take our pick and vote. And I always kind of advocated for people who were involved in outreach. So we invited people like Pamela Gay and Mike Brown came, and so we were at the pub with after Mike Brown's talk. And I was sitting next to him trying to talk to him about his writing. And he said, there's this guy over across the table. His name is Kelly Beatty, and you should really get to know him. Because Kelly Beatty had also shown up at this colloquium. And he said, yeah, he's a editor at Sky and Telescope. And so making that connection actually also helped me down the road. I eventually hit a wall in my research where I couldn't find funding to do what I wanted to do. And I also failed my spectroscopy, my quantum class for the second time. And at that point, this was like spring semester 2013, the department chair sort of, had called a meeting with me and gently suggested, hey, maybe you should try this communication thing that you keep talking about doing. And so I took a minute to collect my thoughts, and then I walked across the street to the office of the co-director of the science journalism department. I told him I was going to apply. So that's how I wound up making the switch from astronomy research to the journalism and writing and editing track. And I really lucked out because just a few weeks later, the AAAS conference happened to be in Boston. And I found out through Googling just randomly that if I joined the National Association of Science Writers, NASW, as a student, which was $50 or whatever, I could get free registration to the AAAS conference as a member of the press. And AAAS is, of course, one of the largest gatherings, not just of scientists, but also of science journalists in the US. And so I spent 4 days and nights at that conference as a member of the press without a clip to my name, but I was getting to meet dozens of the journalists who I had read, and who many of whom were doing great things, would go on to do great things, and then would also become my peers and mentors as I started to try to build out my portfolio and get stories published. One of the things that happens at AAAS is that NASW sponsors a mentor match program and also an internship fair, which is kind of like speed interviews, speed dating style. You go around and interview for 5 minutes with magazines who are taking on summer interns and institutions and all kinds of outlets. And through those two programs, I was matched through the NASW mentor program with Rick Feinberg, former editor of Sky and Telescope and longtime AAS press officer. And then also through the internship fair, I managed to land an internship, that summer internship at Sky and Telescope for the summer. And they did not hire me after 2 weeks on the job, but Monica was basically my mentor at Sky and Tel. And so she taught me everything that I know. And that was kind of my first step into a science writing gig.
Oh my gosh, I love this. All roads, talk about networks, right? All roads lead to this panel and from this panel as well. Thanks so much for that, Mark. You know, we've got a couple of questions. I want to actually combine them. And I want to just ask whoever would like to answer this. So we got a question of whether we or not we need a PhD in order to pursue a science writing editing career. What's the minimum degree requirement? A related question is, would you recommend pursuing a master's in astronomy or a master's in science communication in astronomy instead of a PhD? Who would like, and this is open to all of you, of course, who'd like to address the credential issue? What kind of degree do I need? Do I want? How does it serve me both in the getting the job and then in the job and career itself?
Well, I'm the least credentialed. Oh, go ahead, Mako.
Yeah, sorry, no, I was just going to say I can speak to the PhD version about part of it, which is no, you definitely don't need a PhD to go into science writing. I think it may have helped me get my job at Sky and Telescope only because nobody on staff currently at that time had a PhD in astronomy. Now we do have others now that do, but so that may have helped me, but I'm honestly not sure, but you certainly don't need it. And there's a lot of people on staff who have done a master's in science writing or, you know, just entered the career with just a bachelor's kind of doing, you know, so these are some of the older staff. And I think things may be changing. So this is no longer possible, but just kind of starting off as, you know, the summer intern or, you know, working in the copier office or whatever it is, and you kind of work your way up the ranks, you learn on the job. And you don't need a degree to get started. I do think it can be helpful though, and Mark can probably speak more to this in terms of networking, because you make a lot of connections when you're doing the master's.
Well, and doesn't it also help, like if I have an advanced degree or even a bachelor's degree in astronomy, if I want to go work in astronomy writing and astronomy editing, like, does that also like position me, give me a competitive advantage in the job application process? Like to be able to say that I have at least a basic and maybe even a higher level knowledge of this space.
I mean, I think if you were applying to Sky and Telescope, yes, for sure, it would help you to have a bachelor's, because then you're able just to evaluate the stories or being able to fact check the features or what have you. If you want to go into science writing more generally, you don't necessarily need a bachelor's in astronomy. You could major in some other science and do, like Mark was talking about, writing about climate science and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Mark, did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, I was going to just point out that I'm the least credentialed person on the panel. I don't have a PhD. You know, I'm a PhD dropout, and so in my case, it didn't hurt. You know, and in fact, I'm very glad that I did kind of get, you know, pushed out at the time that I did, because I think those 3 years that I spent working to establish myself in the field of journalism and writing did much more for me than the 3 years that I would have spent at a PhD, or 4 or 5 years in my PhD program trying to finish something that I really wasn't necessarily cut out to do, frankly, or that I found rewarding to do.
That's what I was just going to say, or something that is more enjoyable for you.
Yeah. So absolutely, I would echo everything Monica says. You don't need a PhD. What I really benefited from, I think, from doing those 3 years in the program, though, was, as you alluded to, kind of learn how the sausage is made, to have an inside view in how, you know, science actually gets done, the funding process, you know, where the money goes, how you get it, how papers are published, and how their knowledge is disseminated. I think, you know, being in science gives you a great it cultivates a mental facility to deal with uncertainty. And that's something that you have to deal with a lot in journalism, whether you're writing or you're editing. The facts are uncertain. It's your job to establish what they are and find out what they are, and, you know, find new facts. And so to be able to evaluate them is and to have that facility, I think, is very valuable, and have that expertise in the field is valuable. But it's not so much for me, it was not the degree. It wasn't the piece of paper that helped me out.
That's super helpful. Paul, did you have something you would like to add?
Yeah, so my answer is going to be different. So for Nature, to be a Nature editor, whatever subject you're interested in, a PhD is a prerequisite. So yeah, that's a minimum requirement. Aside from that, there's nothing else that you need. You don't need to have a degree in journalism or anything like that. Just a PhD in a science relevant topic. So astronomy, planetary science, for somebody working on nature astronomy.
That's very helpful too. We're getting more questions. I'm really excited to answer more of them. We got a question. This is an interesting question. As a researcher whose only writing efforts over the last decade have been directed to journal articles, which is typical for a working astronomer, how would one assemble an appropriate writing sample for a job application? I have some thoughts about that, but I'd love to hear what your all thoughts are. Well, while we're on, oh, go ahead, please.
Sure. I mean, I think it is always helpful to have clips, and clips is just the journalism lingo for having ideally a published piece, but it does not have to be published. If you even just have something you've written, you could have blog posts. That was the case when I applied to Sky and Telescope. I had primarily blog posts. I think I had also the pieces that I had written for the media relations at Penn State, but then in addition to that, I had the blog post. So I had kind of the edited and the unedited versions of my writing. And it can actually be quite helpful to even have something that's not published, because then you see how that person really writes and organizes their thoughts. I will say, though, I think one thing that is important, and one thing that it's just very different from the research style of writing, is just the organization. And so even if you don't go and get your master's in science writing or what have you, it helps to read a little bit about how news stories or feature articles, they both have different ways of being organized, and kind of be able to do something of that nature, be able to organize your writing in that way. For news stories, it's having, a lead paragraph that leads you in, and then in that graph that kind of summarizes things up, and you'll come up with all of these terms when you do some research and reading about it. But that can be very helpful for a research scientist who's just getting started in science writing, just to be able to organize your thoughts in that way, because otherwise it's something your editor has to do for you, and that gets more difficult. So.
Absolutely. These are great ideas. Mark, Paul, did you have additional ideas for people who want to build that repertoire and show that they have the experience writing?
Sure, I can take that. I actually also, when I applied to Sky and Tel for that internship, I had mostly blog posts as well, posts that I had written for my own a Blogspot blog at the time, or my Tumblr or something, and but also I did reach out to some folks who sort of ran the astronomy enthusiast website and said, hey, can I write for you? And I did that on my own time as a grad student. But it was helpful then I think to see just how someone else would take my writing and process it. And then also just to be able to say, here is a portfolio. I've started to branch out a little bit and try to do some writing. I mean, the other way to gather clips is a very expensive way, and that's to go to one of the master's programs in science journalism. That is typically not a funded program. You're going to be paying for that or taking out loans, as I did. So I did do that one-year master's program at BU, which actually no longer exists. The program has been shut down, sadly. But the advantage that I got from that was, it was expensive, but it was a year it was a gift to myself to fail a lot, to try a lot of things, to try writing in different styles, to work with professors and take feedback from them on how to properly structure, as Monica was talking about, how to structure a news story, which is very different from writing an academic paper, right? You start the news story with the most important thing, right? Usually you start with the conclusions. That's always, it's backwards. It was for me coming from a scientific background. So that year in the master's program, I would say you definitely don't need to do a master's program like that. But that was what I took away from it, was that year of failing and learning, not being afraid to fail, having a safe space to to fail and to learn. And then also the network that we built as classmates, in our cohort, those people I'm still in touch with, and those are still my friends and the people that I ping, for a second opinion on career things. So that was very powerful as well. I mean, that is another option. In addition to, I wouldn't say it's an alternative to, but in addition to freelancing, in addition to doing summer internships, like Monica and I both did.
Yeah. And that's super helpful to be able to think about there's multiple options to build those clips and to build the network. Paul, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, there's not. We don't work a lot with freelance writers, maybe once or twice a year. So we're just happy to work on a small writing sample. Like that's the basis.
One of my go-tos for people who are interested in building up those clips and demonstrating that they have the writing experience, and also to practice, right? Like what you were saying, Mark, like to even fail and learn more about how to organize a story, and Monica, as you said, learn the lingo like a nut graph, and learn how to build a narrative and incorporate characters. Is right at your fingertips if you work or are part of a university. So almost every university on the planet has a student newspaper or student publication. They probably also have a internal or external magazine. In the United States, we have a lot of research magazines that come out of universities. All of those are in need of people to write articles. And so I always encourage people to pitch the idea of writing a science column for the student newspaper, so that you can get experience, not just writing about astronomy for non-astronomers, but even writing about other areas of science and engineering research and discovery in your institution, because that builds major skills, which are going to really help you. If you have your hand up, please just write the question in the Q&A. We're getting so many more questions. I just want to shift slightly into skills, because there's often a question of like, what skills do I need to be building? You've talked a little bit, all of you today, about the types of skills. You've touched on them, hinted at them, but I'd like to get a sense of like, what are some of the skills that if you were hiring for your job, if you were hiring yourself into your job, what skills have been especially helpful to you? And what skills have you been able to draw from your background in astronomy that have been helpful to you? I'd love to hear a little bit about how you sort of incorporate and leverage those skills, because there's so many opportunities within astronomy to develop communication skills and the critical thinking and the research and the application skills that are useful to this career field. Who'd like to take it?
Okay, maybe I can say.
Go ahead. Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, something that comes from, I think, naturally from being a researcher in astronomy is that you learn to develop critical thinking. So you have to think about, what's in front of you critically. Is this true? Does this make sense? Is this conclusion supported by, data or evidence? And so as an editor, certainly as a scientific editor looking at manuscripts, papers every day, that critical thinking, that questioning skill really comes into play. So that's one key thing that I think you can develop quite easily as a researcher, just by, like as I said at the top of the hour, just by reading widely, looking at different papers in different topics, and just asking questions about what the paper's telling you, and trying to find out the answer. That would be a good skill to develop, I think.
I love it. Monica, do you have some thoughts about skills that are really, really helpful to you?
I think critical thinking would also apply for my job as well, because I think in a little bit different context, but just being able to evaluate a new result and say, how significant is this? Is this something that's interesting just to astronomers? Is like a new survey, for example, might be really exciting in that it's like providing a lot of new data, but if there's no actual results coming out of it, is it going to be interesting for the general reader? Kind of developing that kind of the nuanced thinking to be able to tell the difference between what's really interesting and what isn't. I think there's also, for me anyway, there was a lot of carryover, because I'm still basically doing astronomy every day in terms of reading papers or press releases. Not actively doing the research, but I know, I'm effectively doing it just in terms of being able to understand what it is I'm reading. So I'm definitely, a lot of those skills carry over. And then I think Clear communication, I think, like you mentioned, I think scientists also need to clearly communicate to each other. And even though the organization may be different in a research article than in a news story, but the ability to clearly explain something is going to be there or not there, regardless. And so if you can take that over with you, you might have to explain more jargon, for example, but that ability is there. So.
Yeah. I love what you just said, Monica, and I just want to sort of like put a huge, like 100,000 exclamation points next to it, that you are still in astronomy. You have not left astronomy, you are still in astronomy, and that's such an important thing to think about, particularly for astronomers who are looking beyond academia, looking beyond the traditional or conventional research jobs. They may think, wait a second, I'm going to leave astronomy. No, you don't have to leave astronomy. You are in astronomy. You can stay in astronomy. It's just going to look a little bit differently based on your own loves and skills and the things that you want to do. So I love that you said that, Monica. Mark, do you have some thoughts about skills? Tell us about your skills.
Sure, I will definitely second Monica on news judgment. That is a huge, especially as an editor, that's half the job, is to judge whether or not something is news. And so to be able to read a press release and not take it at face value, but then go download the paper and read the paper and see for yourself, is this a new result? Is it incremental? Is it a breakthrough? That's huge. I mean, other skills, in terms of the things that I did as a graduate student, some of them surprisingly became helpful. Coding, I was not a fantastic programmer, but the coding that I did do gave me the ability at least to be comfortable with a lot of web stuff, HTML, and just, I could install WordPress, just kind of like basic skills, but I found were actually very helpful. They made me useful in a lot of journalism contexts where people did not necessarily have that skill. I could volunteer for the Asian American Journalists Association to help them run their conference website, their annual conference website. And that became another way to meet people and to become involved. I would also say, actually, photography is something that now I deal with as an editor. It's actually one of my roles at Astronomy, is I'm also the photo editor. And I had a personal, interest in photography, but that was definitely enhanced by the work that I did as as an astronomer. So much of what you do when you deal with astronomy imaging is photography, right? It's you understand how to manipulate that photographic data at a very basic level, and that is carried over now into being an editor for photos, working with astro imagers, editing technical articles about astrophotography. That I would never have guessed necessarily that would be helpful, but it absolutely was. And then I think another thing too is just the sort of going along with the critical thinking. For me, part of being an editor is being easily confused, and because if you, as I all too often did as a grad student, read a science paper and I just kind of power through and I convince myself that I've understood what they're saying. If I'm sitting in journal club and I'm nodding along, yep, oh yeah, I understand what we're talking about. That is, death for an editor. And so learning to listen to my inner, I don't get this. And to realize that was kind of like, that's like an editor's secret weapon. It's not a downside. That's what you have to have, that is that inner voice. Go, this doesn't make sense. This isn't clear. This sentence, it just doesn't flow quite right. To be sensitive to that really helped.
I love it. And I would add to this also business skills, project management skills, finance skills, leadership and management and team building skills, all of those things, which of course you naturally get from astronomy as well. We have a couple of links in the chat for you right now. One of the benefits that you have as a member of the AAS is the fact that you can actually book a free, not free, but it's a private confidential career consultation with me at a very, very, very discounted rate. And Diane threw that link in the chat. So if you want to go into a deep dive about your career questions, about how to build a career in this space or other areas of science communications, you are welcome to book that right now. We're also going to put all of our contact information, my LinkedIn and all the emails from everybody that you've heard from today in the chat. And we want to give you a free resume template. This is something that you can use and adapt for careers in science communication, science journalism, science editing, and publishing. And so to get that, you can take a photo of this QR code or go to talk.ac/Alaina G. Levine, enter the code publishing, and you'll be able to get that. And the link also is in the chat, so you can directly link for that. While we do that, we have 5 minutes left, and I want to just ask the panel, in just a few moments, can you give us one or two final bits of wisdom? What are the things that we as astronomers, wherever we are and whenever we are in our career today, what can we do today to position ourselves for success for a career in science editing and publishing tomorrow? And Paul, I'd love to start with you. What's your one final or two final thoughts? What can I do today? Please.
I would say that jobs are rare, like jobs in our profession, I think are rare, particularly as I mentioned before, there aren't many full-time editor roles on a science journal. And also with science writing, to get a position on a magazine is hard to do. And so when you see an opportunity, just go for it. Like, they don't come very often. Just give it a shot.
I love it. Thank you. Be courageous.
Exactly.
I love it. Mark, what's your final thing for us to think about going forward, please?
It's not necessarily a thing to do today, but I think that you can do every day, which in terms of evaluating the sort of the vast array of opportunities that are out there to write, but only a small fraction of which may meet your criteria for what what is actually going to benefit you and what is going to, pay your bills. I mean, that's for real, right? The most helpful piece of advice I ever got was, as a freelancer, when you're looking at what to take on, was to look at 3 criteria. Does this particular job or this article or whatever I'm working on, this particular gig, is it fulfilling? Is it paying me well, what I deserve? And is it advancing my career? And the rule of thumb that's always done very well for me is if it meets 2 of those 3, then it's worth taking a look at. Maybe it's not fulfilling, but if it pays your bills and it will pay off for you down the road in terms of advancing your career, maybe it's worth doing. Maybe it does pay well, but it's not fulfilling, but it will advance your career, then it's also maybe worth doing. So those 2 out of 3 rule, that's worked for me a lot. That's kind of been my North Star.
I love that. That's brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Mark. Monica, what's one final or 2 final things that we should be doing today?
Okay, yeah, I'm glad you said 2 because I actually had 2 and I was trying to decide which one. The first thing I would say is just know why you're doing what you're doing. I think knowing your own values or your own motivation is really helpful, especially when anything gets hard. And whether you're freelancing and dealing with the competitive, freelancing world or the insecure freelancing world, or whether you have a staff position, but you have all the baggage that comes with the staff position, knowing your motivation for doing those things and knowing your values is really important for helping you kind of power through that. And then the other thing is, if you're interested in science editing or publishing, just start writing. Start pitching if you're ready to pitch. But they're the editors. At least I can speak for myself anyway. I'm always excited to get pitches, and I'm definitely open to that. And I believe you're sharing our emails at the end too. So.
I love it. That's such a great way to leave the conversation today, Monica. I feel so inspired. Just do it. Just write. Get out there, be courageous, and follow the rule of 2 out of 3 from you, Mark. I love it. Monica, Mark, Paul, this has been such a privilege and a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time and your candor, for being so generous with your insight and wisdom about this field. I think we're going to have more conversations about this in the future, but I'm really thrilled that you were able to join us today. And thank you all for the opportunity to present. Thank you, Diane. As always, it's fantastic to work with you. Round of applause. And please stay in touch, everyone. And here's to your unicorn career in science editing and publishing. Thank you so much.